Good evening, everyone. This is Ashley from Written in Ash. And tonight I'm going to be reading another short, scary story. This one is from a book called Ghosts and Witches Aplenty. More Tales Our Settlers Told by Joseph and Edith Raskin. The story I'm going to be reading is A Pot of Trouble. Salem, place of peace, was far from peaceful at the time Mary March was growing up. There were tales of ghosts and witches aplenty in those days, and no person in that Massachusetts village believed himself safe from their evil spells. The good folks were worried, and all they could do was fast and pray that they be spared from their worst enemies, the devil and his crew. Mary March did her share of praying, but as every sunrise promised the day of delightful happening, she left worrying to her elders. At the age of 18, she was a beautiful girl with a fair complexion, blue eyes, and a full mouth that was ready at any moment to curve into a merry smile. The girls of the village were jealous of her good looks, and there was no end to their envy when they heard she was marrying Willie Brown. They had good reason to be envious, for Willie Brown, in addition to being a most likable lad, was also a prosperous farmer. "She doesn't deserve him. She is too flighty to make him a good wife," they whispered when the young couple were married. While Mary paid little attention to the gossip that reached her ears, the unfriendly behavior of Willie's mother was a burden in her new life. Ever since her mother-in-law had become a widow, she had clung to Willie and lived in fear of losing him. Convinced that no girl was good enough to be his wife, she let Mary know in many subtle ways that she was not welcome in their house. Mary tried to win the older woman's love, but no matter what she did, she was met with a frown. "Don't you go messing up the dishes in the cupboard again," the woman scolded her after Mary had washed some and placed some on the wrong shelf. "Did I do that?" Mary said innocently, and proceeded to rearrange them properly. This only infuriated Mrs. Brown the more. Turning away, she muttered to herself, "I know her witching ways." Scarcely a day went by that Mrs. Brown did not find some fault with her daughter-in-law. Many tried to take this lightly, hoping in time her mother-in-law would get over resenting her presence. And when Willie came home from work, she would meet him with a bright smile, as if nothing unpleasant had happened during the day. One morning, hearing that the village merchant had just received a fresh supply of cloth from Boston, and Mary hurried over and bought a length of it for a dress. It was a lovely dotted pattern, a kind not seen in Salem before. Excited over her purchase and impatient to see how the material became her, Mary wrapped it around her before the mirror as soon as she got home. "What are you up to?" Mrs. Brown demanded suspiciously. "I am making a dress for myself. I hope Willie will like it," Mary replied with shining eyes. "Only a wicked woman would wear such a gaudy dress," the woman berated her. Snatching the cloth from Mary, she said, "I'll have to keep an eye on you to see that you behave properly." Upset and worried, this time Mary told her husband what had happened. "Don't pay attention to her antics," he laughed. "Father and I never did. Beneath her simple, homespun mother really has a kind heart." After the incident with the dress, Mrs. Brown rarely spoke to her daughter-in-law. Instead, she spent a good deal of her time sitting at the big fireplace, doggedly watching Mary out of the corner of her eye. Mary, remembering what Willie told her, gradually accustomed herself to the woman's behavior and went about cheerfully attending to her own chores. One morning, Mrs. Brown ventured out to see her neighbor and pick up some bits of gossip. Returning a while later, she found Mary leaning over a steaming pot hanging on the crane in the fireplace. Tiptoeing closer, she saw Mary plunge her hand into the boiling water in the pot and pull out a long white bag. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Startled, Mary didn't reply at once. Then, as she was transferring the white bag to a pewter dish, she said with a mysterious smile, "You'll see." The table was set and the steaming pewter dish placed on it for when Willie came home for his midday meal. After the prayer was said, Mary turned to Mrs. Brown with sparkling eyes. "Now, Mother, lift the cover and see what's underneath." As Mrs. Brown remained sitting with a frozen face, Willie obliged and lifted the cover from the dish, revealing round dumplings. "I don't think it's pudding, and they aren't cakes," he observed, mystified. "Then what are they?" Putting a dumpling on his plate, Mary said importantly, "Cut it open." Expectantly, Willie cut the crust open, and behold, there was a prize, an apple inside. "Isn't this a wonderful surprise?" For a moment, old Mrs. Brown silently glowered at the outlandish concoction. Then she grabbed the pewter dish with the rest of the dumplings and ran out of the room. "What's wrong, Mother?" Willie called after her, but his mother had already left the house, locking the pair inside. Turning pale and clinging to her husband, Mary cried, "Oh, Willie, I'm afraid she is out to do us harm." Willie tried to laugh it off. "Frightened of Mother? Why, everybody in the neighborhood will tell you that she has the kindest heart they've ever known." Barely an hour had passed when half the village came storming to the house, led by old Mrs. Brown. There in the crowd was the parson, praying for the sinner, and the deacons with grave faces, ready to join in denouncing whatever evil spirit might be found lurking in the house. The women were screaming threats, while the sheriff was trying to hold them back by the force of his mighty voice. "The evil one is in there," old Mrs. Brown shrieked, unlocking the door. "Don't let the witch escape." The sheriff, accompanied by some villagers, tore into the room to find Willie standing with his arm around his trembling wife. "We want her," the sheriff demanded, pointing at Mary. "She's accused of being a witch." Seeing that Willie Brown showed no willingness to hand over his wife, the sheriff moved toward him. "Don't you touch her. She is innocent," Willie warned, stepping in front of his wife to protect her. Fearing that the sheriff, encouraged by the righteous villagers, would harm Willie, Mary pleaded with her husband, "Let me go with them. They are our friends. I trust their fair judgment." But Willie stubbornly refused to heed Mary's pleas and violently resisted the sheriff's attempt to snatch her. Overwhelmed by sheer numbers, he was finally knocked to the ground, and Mary was led away to prison. Leaning over her son, old Mrs. Brown prayed, "Oh God, forgive you, Willie," and the deacon echoed her, "Amen." Some days later, Mary was brought to court for questioning. "You are accused of preparing a fiendish concoction," one of the judges declared. "Are you willing to confess your guilt?" "I have nothing to confess. I am innocent, Your Honor," Mary replied bravely. "And it wasn't a fiendish concoction, but simply apple dumplings that I made." The judge raised his brows. "Apple dumplings? What in God's name is that?" "A new delicious dish, Your Honor," Mary enlightened him. The judge shook his head doubtfully, went into a huddle with the other judges to decide what to make of Mary's unexpected declaration. They finally decided to stage a novel trial. The village was buzzing with excitement, and people came from near and far on the day of the trial. Work was put aside, and everybody donned holiday clothes. Court was being held on Willie Brown's green field. On this September day was loaded with ripening apples. By afternoon, everything was ready for the trial to begin. The parson made his way through the crowd and arranged his bulky self on the high bench. Below him, Mrs. Brown took her place along with 12 churchmen who were to proclaim the final verdict. A huge crowd gathered in the field and with anticipation as an open fire was prepared and a black kettle filled with water hung over it. Their suspense was increased when a board was set up and a mound of flour. Some apples and a dish were placed on it. Suddenly a murmur went through the crowd. "There she is, the witch!" Stretching their necks and standing on tiptoes, they tried to get a better glimpse of her. Unruffled by their catcalls, Mary smiled to them as she advanced towards the stand, but she couldn't help noticing the sneer on the face of that pampered youth of the village whom she had refused to marry. Nor did she fail to see her envious girlfriends standing together and glowing at the prospect of the punishment to be pronounced on her. As she rolled up her sleeves and put on the apron, a hush descended upon the field. There was not a breeze now to disturb the air, and not the slightest rustle of leaves in the orchard. Even the grasshoppers stopped their singing and seemed to join the crowd in watching. While the crowd was merely curious, the parson and the 12 stately churchmen sitting in judgment were wholly concentrating on Mary's every move. They saw Mary drop the strange bag into the black pot filled with boiling water, and sitting back and folding their hands, they waited. "Half an hour," the parson thundered at last, holding his watch up to his eyes. The 12 elders gathered around the black pot and, frowning, stared into its deep bottom. "For my part, I prefer the old ways to the new," one of the elders grumbled. "The proper way to deal with the witch is to put her in a bonfire." "That's true," another elder replied. "I too believe in the justice of our Lord and the good laws of the past, but let us be patient and reserve our judgment for the time being." While the worthy men were thus exchanging their views, the parson himself stepped down from his high seat, armed with a pair of tongs. With the skill of an experienced fisherman, he dipped his tongs into the boiling water and pulled out the white bag. Then, carrying the steaming mess to the board, he cut the hemp string with a firm hand and rolled the dumplings into a dish. "I watched every move of this, Mary Brown," he finally announced. "There was no magic to making dumplings. I can testify to that." The 12 elders nodded their heads in full agreement. Of course, they proclaimed. Astonished by the verdict of not guilty for a few moments, the crowd remained silent. Presently their mood changed, and the field resounded with "Hurrah, hurrah!" and the distant hills echoed "Hurrah, hurrah, 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 hurrah." Mary soon became a much respected person in Salem and was admired by all those who a short while before had considered her a witch. "We knew right along you were innocent," her girlfriends now assured her. No longer did old Mrs. Brown sit at the fireplace spying on Mary. On the contrary, she even insisted on helping whenever Mary was making that novel dish, apple dumplings. The end. Well, this one wasn't exactly scary. Well, none of them really are, because they're kind of like kids' books. I just like these stories remind me of being a kid. My mom and dad used to read them all the time to me and my sisters. But it seemed more like a history lesson type thing. Everybody thought people were witches for every little different thing or whatever back in them days. So it's actually kind of interesting, kind of like another thing for kids to tell them about stuff like that in a way, simplify it or whatever, saying, that everybody's a witch because stuff's different back in those days. So, but whatever, I thought it was kind of cool. Like, share, subscribe, and I'll be reading to you soon. Bye-bye.
Don't be scared. Like, subscribe, share.